A king buried his entire fortune under the body of Christ. Behind iron doors, guarded by monks who owned nothing, in one of the most sacred buildings in England, he thought it was the one place on earth no one would dare touch. He was wrong. Months later, that vault was empty, and the king's gold was turning up in the last places anyone expected, in London brothels, in pawnshops, tangled in fishermen's nets pulled from the bottom of the Thames. This is the story of the man who did it. A ruined wool merchant with nothing left to lose, who studied a fortress for months, tunneled into it by hand, and spent an entire extra day inside a king's treasury. Not because he was reckless, but because he was patient enough to do it right. It's the biggest heist of the Middle Ages, and for a while, almost nobody noticed. To understand why Richard of Pudlicote did what he did, you have to understand what England had already taken from him. Richard was a wool merchant, and in the late 1200s, that was a brutal profession to be in. A disease was tearing through English sheep flocks, wiping out huge portions of the national herd. Wool exports, the backbone of the medieval English economy, collapsed. Merchants who had built their entire lives around wool watched their livelihoods disappear almost overnight. And then, the king made it worse. King Edward I needed money. A lot of it. He was fighting wars on two fronts, crushing rebellion in Scotland and funding endless campaigns in France. So he did what kings have always done. He taxed his people harder. Wool exports, already collapsing, were hit with a crushing new tax the English called the maltolt, literally, the bad tax. It started small. By the 1290s, it had multiplied nearly 6 times over. Richard was caught in the middle of it. At some point during his travels as a merchant, he was arrested abroad, in Flanders, over an outstanding debt. His wool, his entire stock, his livelihood, was seized by English authorities to settle the matter. He came home with nothing. So he did what any ruined man with a grievance might do. He went to court. He tried to get his goods back through the system the legal way, in Westminster, the seat of English royal power. The court didn't help him. But sitting in Westminster, waiting, watching, broke and furious, Richard noticed something else instead. He noticed how casually the most valuable objects in England were being handled just a few feet away from him. Westminster Abbey wasn't just a church, it was quite literally the vault of the English crown. Beneath the abbey, behind those 3 iron doors, sat the king's treasury. Coin, gold and silver plate, jewels, the accumulated wealth of a kingdom. Above ground, the abbey functioned as a monastery, home to Benedictine monks who had taken vows of poverty and simplicity. It was an almost absurd contradiction. Extreme wealth guarded by men who had sworn to own nothing. And Richard, sitting in Westminster day after day fighting his case, started to notice how loosely that contradiction was managed. Officials moved treasure in and out. Routines were casual. Nobody expected a threat. Because who would be insane enough to rob the King of England in a holy site with his soul on the line? Richard began quietly to become exactly that person. He didn't start with the vault. He started small, testing the building, testing its people. He managed to get his hands on a modest haul of silver from elsewhere in the Abbey complex. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to do something clever with. He spent it on the monks themselves, wine, company, favors. He made himself familiar, likable, present. The kind of man nobody looks at twice because he's already part of the furniture. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told in heist movies. The slow work. Not a masked man scaling a wall in the dead of night, but months of ordinary, boring, patient presence, becoming someone the monks trusted enough to stop watching closely. By the time Richard was ready to make his real move, he wasn't an outsider anymore. He was inside. In December of 1302, Richard began to dig. Not a dramatic break-in, a tunnel, slow, physical, exhausting labor, carried out in secret, inch by inch toward the heart of the treasury. He had studied the building for months by this point, the layout, the timing of the monks' routines, the movements of the few officials who still checked on the vault, and crucially, he had one enormous advantage. King Edward I wasn't in London. He was hundreds of miles north, leading his army against William Wallace and the Scots. The court, and much of the machinery of royal government, had moved with him. The man whose fortune this was, the one person with the most reason to be paranoid about its safety, was as far away as he could possibly be. For 4 months, Richard dug, through winter, in secret. With almost nobody knowing what was happening a few feet beneath one of the holiest buildings in England. Imagine the discipline that takes. Every day, the risk of discovery. Every day, the temptation to rush, to cut corners, to just force his way in and grab what he could. And every day, he didn't. He kept digging methodically, toward a target he'd already spent months preparing for. By late April 1303, the tunnel was finished. Richard of Pawlkaw was standing on the threshold of the king's fortune. On the night of April 24, 1303, Richard broke through into the treasury. And here's the detail that separates this heist from almost every other crime of its era. He didn't panic. He didn't grab an armful of gold and run for the door. He stayed. Richard spent an entire extra day inside the vault itself, moving among a year's worth of England's entire tax revenue, gold and silver plate, antique coin, precious gems collected from every corner of the kingdom. He sorted through it. He decided, item by item, what was worth the risk of taking and what wasn't. Try to picture that scene for a second. A ruined wool merchant, alone, underground, surrounded by more wealth than he would see in a dozen lifetimes. And instead of losing his mind with greed, he's calmly cataloging it, thinking like a professional. It's one of the strangest, most human details in the entire story. The plan wasn't chaos. It was control. Only after that second night did Richard finally leave, for good this time, hauling out the treasure he'd chosen and burying a portion of it beneath a cemetery gate near a nearby church, hiding his fortune in the ground before he dared to spend a penny of it. For a short window of time, it must have felt like the perfect crime. The vault was breached, the loot was hidden. The king was still 400 miles away, fighting a war, with no idea that his treasury had just been gutted. But perfect crimes have a way of undoing themselves, and this one was about to collapse in the most embarrassing way imaginable. Here's the problem with stealing an entire kingdom's tax revenue. You can't spend it quietly. There was simply too much of it. Too much gold, too many jewels, too much antique coin to sell off carefully, discreetly, one piece at a time, without anyone noticing a pattern. And so, within weeks, King Edward's treasure started resurfacing, in the worst possible places for staying hidden. Pieces turned up in London pawnshops, sold by people who had no idea or didn't care where they'd really come from. Treasure appeared in the city's brothels, passed along as payment or gifts. And strangest of all, fishermen working the Thames began pulling royal treasure up in their nets, items that had apparently been dumped or lost in the panic of trying to move it. Gold does not stay quiet, and a heist this size didn't just leave a trail, it left a flood. Word reached the king in Scotland. And whatever grim satisfaction Richard might have felt in those first weeks evaporated the moment Edward I turned his full attention, and his fury, back toward Westminster. Edward I did not treat this as an ordinary robbery. It couldn't be. This wasn't some back alley thief. This was an attack on the financial foundation of his entire kingdom, carried out inside one of the most sacred buildings in England. The investigation that followed was massive, and it didn't stop at Richard. It tore through Westminster Abbey itself. Evidence pointed to the involvement of the monks, the very men who were supposed to be guarding the treasury, not helping empty it. More than 40 of them were implicated. Dozens of people were rounded up. Monks, officials, ordinary Londoners caught holding stolen goods they may or may not have known were royal treasure. It became one of the largest criminal trials of the entire High Middle Ages, a legal storm that consumed Westminster for months. Richard himself was eventually captured, and in his confession, he made one final calculated move. He claimed he had acted completely alone. It wasn't true, and the trial evidence made that clear. But by taking full responsibility, Richard shielded the churchmen who had helped him, the very people whose trust he'd spent months carefully building. Whether it was loyalty, guilt, or one last act of control over his own story, we don't know. But it worked. Most of the monks implicated in the plot ultimately escaped execution. Richard did not. He was hanged for his crime, one of the most audacious thefts in English history, brought down not by a chase or a sword fight, but by the simple, unavoidable fact that stolen fortunes are very, very hard to hide. For centuries afterward, a gruesome legend attached itself to this story. According to the legend, after Richard was executed, his body was flayed, and his skin was nailed to the door of Westminster Abbey itself, a grim warning to any future thief who dared think about robbing the king again. It's a haunting image. It's also, as it turns out, not true. In 2005, researchers finally got the chance to closely study that very door, the actual surviving door of the chapter house at Westminster Abbey, which happens to be the oldest door in all of England, dating back to Edward I's reign. Beneath its lone surviving iron strap, they found fragments of old hide. Forensic analysis revealed the truth. It wasn't human skin at all. It was simply the remains of animal hide, once used as a covering for the door itself. A completely ordinary piece of medieval construction, misread by centuries of storytellers as something far more macabre. Which means that even the legend of this heist turned out to be its own kind of trick. People believing for hundreds of years in a myth that was never real. So, what actually beat the safest vault in medieval England? Not a small army, not brute force, not even luck, really. It was patience, trust, carefully built and just as carefully exploited. And a broken, overlooked man that nobody in a fortress full of gold ever thought to watch closely enough. The vault survived a war. It didn't survive being underestimated.